So having talked a little bit about the historical events, the political, economic, and social events that helped to shape the time period prior to and during the heyday of classical utilitarianism, let's turn our attention now to that central utilitarian doctrine. So classical utilitarians like Mill and Bentham and Sedgwick are all hedonists. Now you recall that hedonism is the view that pleasure is the highest or only human value or goal. It's the one goal that human beings have that is pursued not in service of other goals, but in and of itself. It's intrinsically valuable. Now, the moral theory that's associated with hedonism holds that human beings should act in ways that maximize that goal, maximize pleasure. So pure hedonists, they're really all about feeling good. And we see this hedonist strain in Mill's articulation of what he calls the greatest happiness principle. And that principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. And by happiness, Mill intends pleasure in the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. However, for Mill at least, pleasure has a wider meaning than pure sensual pleasure. Mill claims that human beings have faculties that are more elevated than those of mere animal appetites, higher faculties, intellectual, emotional, spiritual faculties. And when once made conscious of these faculties, human beings, he claims, don't regard any state as happiness unless it includes the gratification of these higher appetites. And thus he has this famous motto: it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. So for Mill, pleasures of the intellect, so learning and theorizing, pleasures of feelings, so social bonds, personal relationships, and acts of imagination and creativity, as well as moral sentiments. These are all faculties that humans have that result in happiness, and happiness that has a higher value than mere sensual pleasure. So Mill would disagree with our pig here. Our pig thinks that mere sensual gratification is the ultimate in happiness. Mill, you can be completely satisfied in all your basic physical animal appetites and not be happy. To be happy, you also have to address your needs of intellect, of social connection, of imagination, of moral duty. So Mill is going to evaluate an action's goodness by its actual consequences. He's not going to consider the possible consequences prospectively, or the likely consequences even. The only outcomes, the only consequences that he's going to be interested in is the happiness or the unhappiness that is the immediate result of the action itself. No other features of the act or any of its further wider effects are going to determine its moral status. As Rachel notes, right, this is a very equitable notion because every individual who's directly affected by an action, their happiness will be quantified in some way and added together. Happiness positive, unhappiness negative, and the total, the joint generated happiness or unhappiness that's the direct consequence of that action, that's going to be the sole determiner of its ethical status, whether it was ethically good or bad or neutral or supererogatory. So characterizations of actions or choices like we find in Forrest Gump, where life is like a box of chocolates, these sorts of metaphorical and speculative ideas about how to go about regulating one's life are going to be rejected as completely irrelevant to Mill. For Mill, each action is evaluated in and of itself by looking at its direct actual consequences, and specifically the net happiness and unhappiness that's generated by the people who are immediately affected by that action. And recall, this happiness is going to include both basic sensual kinds of pleasure as well as these higher order pleasures. Finally, the moral rightness of actions is going to depend completely on the sum good of the consequences for all the people or the sentient beings that are directly affected, where their happiness is assigned an equal weight. And as a result of that, utilitarians were very sort of hard-nosed empiricists about the ethical status of various laws, various actions. So, for example, the Poor Act of 1834 resulted in a tremendous amount of unhappiness. And as a result, utilitarians would look at the Poor Act of 1834 and conclude that it was morally wrong. And they would accept that consequence, embrace it as a failure, and seek to revise or reform that law to try and change the net happiness in the favor of greater happiness for a greater number. And so utilitarians were capable of recognizing failure and instigating reform based on real-world consequences, and in this way they're kind of admirable. They don't try and sidestep, duck, or lay blame on others for wrong choices. The choices for them are to be calculated in a very direct way. They are what they are, and to be morally correct, one always has to seek actions or to try and correct one's actions in a way that creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And so the utilitarians did recognize the Poor Act of 1834 as a mistake, and they sought to reform it in ways that they hoped would make the law much more effective in creating happiness for the greatest number. So that's the core utilitarian doctrine. Now, in Rachel's chapter, he talks about how the doctrine might be used to justify various things. For instance, the legalization of marijuana. Now, in On Liberty, Mill argues extensively for the legalization of drugs. And it's kind of ironic because it is an empirical failing on Mill's part. As Mill wrote the history of the British East India Company, and that was largely a history of the opium trade. Not exclusively, but very much so. And the opium trade was a terrible sinkhole of unhappiness. And Mill knew this. Nevertheless, he towed this libertarian line that drugs should be legalized because the greatest happiness would be achieved by allowing people to make choices, and that the unhappiness of bad choices wouldn't be as great as the happiness created by the freedom to choose, which empirically is really not supported. And so it's kind of interesting that Rachel chooses that as one of his examples, even though he's very correct in noting that utilitarians will look at any act, whether it's a legal act, whether it's a personal act, and they'll try and be as hard-bitten, empirical, and honest about its consequences and hence its ethical status as they possibly can be.